Good evening. I'm Michael Taylor. I am the Chief Curator and Deputy Director for Art and Education here at VMFA, and it gives me tremendous pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event. This is time to coincide with the opening week of the Willie Anne Wright Artist and Alchemist exhibition. So, before I introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Sarah Kennel, I want to give a special shout out to our sponsors, the William R. Kenan Jr. Charitable Trust, who have made it possible for VMFA to have American Sign Language interpretation available tonight and at future programs at the museum. And we have our signers behind me. I have given them a copy of my speech. So this is really important, as you all know, and we're just so grateful to our sponsors for making it happen. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sarah Kennel, who joined VMFA in June of 2021 as the inaugural Aaron Siskin Curator of Photography and the Director of the Razor Center for Works on Paper. A specialist in 19th and 20th century photography, Sarah has curated, published, and presented widely on topics ranging from 19th century French photography and historic photographic processes to European modernism and understudied women photographers. You can see how Willie Anne Wright plays into this. She has also written extensively on the relationship between painting and photography in 19th century France and completed a dissertation on the relationship between dance and the visual arts in early 20th century culture. Before joining VMFA, Sarah held positions at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, where she curated the exhibition Underexposed: Women Photographers from the Collection, and the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, where she co-curated the acclaimed touring exhibition Sally Mann, 1,000 Crossings, as well as a retrospective of the work of Olivia Parker. Dr. Kennel launched her curatorial career at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., where she organized a number of exhibitions, including Charles Marville, photographer of Paris, Diaghilev and the Golden Age of the Ballet Russe, 1909 to 1929, which has the great subtitle, When Art Danced with Music, The Serial Portrait, Photography and Identity in the Past 100 Years, and In the Darkroom, Photographic Processes Before the Digital Age. Sarah holds a doctorate and a Master of Arts degree in art history from the University of California, Berkeley, and a Bachelor of Arts degree from Princeton University. Not too shabby. She is currently working on a major exhibition of photography entitled A Long Arc: Photography in the American South Since 1845, which she organized with the High Museum of Art, where it is on view right now, and it will come to VMFA next October. So you'll be back in this auditorium to hear her speaking again, I'm sure, a year from now. Now, if that wasn't enough, she's also made stunning acquisitions of photographs, many of which are on view in the photography gallery on the third floor, in the corridor on the way from a muse to the bathroom. We are going to have a new wing, by the way, and a major expansion, and we're going to have the best photography galleries of any museum. It's coming, I promise. But tonight, she's going to talk about Willie Anne Wright, her extraordinary career as a photographer and a painter. And as many of you know, the museum now possesses the largest and most comprehensive collection of Willie Anne's work. Earlier this year, VMFA acquired 10 paintings and 236 photographs, adding to the 43 Willie Anne Wright works already in the collection. And the artist, in turn, generously donated her archives to our Margaret R. and Robert M. Freeman Library. This major acquisition was a wonderful collaboration between our photography and modern contemporary departments and the library. We love it when we work together. We are humbled and grateful to be able to present a selection of 9 paintings and 64 photographs from this acquisition in the Willie Anne Wright Artist and Alchemist exhibition that Sarah brilliantly curated, and in the fully illustrated catalog that she wrote for and edited to accompany the artist retrospective, and I show you it here, on sale in our gift shop. Get your copy tonight. I will see you in the exhibition upstairs afterwards, but for now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Kennel to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'd like to think that this full house is here for me, but I know how beloved Willie Anne is in this community, so thank you for coming and supporting her. I wanted to start by thanking Katie Domrat and our education department for putting together tonight's program, as well as all of the programs, including classes at the studio school and lots of lectures. So thank you very much. So the exhibition celebrates and really delves into the career of an extraordinary artist, one who recently celebrated her 99th birthday. But my talk tonight will focus a little bit on the relationship that Willie Anne has forged with the VMFA. This relationship has lasted 79 years. As I said the other day, it's longer than almost all marriages and many lifetimes. That relationship first started in 1944 when Willie Anne was 20 years old, and she had 2 watercolors exhibited at this museum. It was an exhibition that was devoted to the best work of students in area colleges. And it was organized under the director, Beatrice von Keller, who was actually the interim director at that time because the VMFA's inaugural director, Thomas Colt, was on active duty. So that was VMFA's first woman director. Now, Willie Anne was only 20, and she was a college student at William and Mary. She had been born 20 years earlier in Richmond, Virginia. And she had always loved art as a child. In fact, her father was somewhat of an artist and a painter. Although he may have shared his talent for art with her, he did not share his drawing pencils. And in fact, her parents did not encourage her to focus on art in college. They wanted her to do something more practical with her career. So she studied psychology at William and Mary. But she had always taken painting classes and managed to get into painting seminars with one of William and Mary's renowned professors, Thomas Thorne, and he kind of took her under his wing. And so during her college career, she did produce works like this one, which is on view in the exhibition. This is made in 1942, so she was only 18. And I think you can see here, yes, it's an early work, but clearly already there's an affinity for color and Willie Anne's grasp of kind of the great masters of 19th and early 20th century art. We might see a little Van Gogh, a little Rouault in here. But I think at that time, at age 20, when her watercolors were up at VMFA, nobody could have imagined what was to come. And in fact, Willie Anne herself, it would be quite some time before her work returned to VMFA. In 1946, she graduated with a degree in psychology from William and Mary and married her high school sweetheart, Jack Wright, who had been fighting the war in Europe and returned home with a Purple Heart. And the couple moved to Boston, where he pursued his degree at MIT. And actually, over the next decade, they moved several times. Willie Anne taught at school. She did some psychology testing, and she continued to paint wherever she could, usually taking night classes. During this period, she also had 3 children. In 1954, she moved back to Richmond, and this really is the beginning of a kind of new period in her art. In 1958, she enrolls full-time in classes at the Richmond Professional Institute, which is now VCU, but it was called RPI then. And in 1960, she began a full-time master's program there. Now, this was pretty extraordinary for a couple reasons. First, she was a married mother of 3 in her 40s, and she was starting art school with a bunch of 20-year-olds in the 1960s. But I believe that these experiences, instead of holding her back, really helped to shape her identity as an artist and as a person. Now, she actually wrote her master's thesis on the image of woman in 20th century art. That's the title. And it really consists of two portions. There's the analytic or written portion, and then there's her paintings, which were kind of a response to the analytic portion. And I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but in the analytic portion of her master's thesis, she chooses 4 painters, each of whom represents a different kind of style of 20th century painting: abstract expressionism, art brut, figurative, and pop art. And she looks at their representations of women in relation to changing notions of gender and women's roles in society. And she also really takes on this question of the transformation of women in society. And she is citing and reading people like Betty Friedan and Simone de Beauvoir. She also, however, included in her research newspaper clippings, including relationship columns, Dear Abbeys and things like that. And this actually was a practice that she continued for the next decade. One of the wonderful things about acquiring artists' archives is that we really get to sort of peer open the artistic process a little bit. And when my colleagues and I, and here I want to acknowledge Dr. Sarah Eckhart, our Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art, who has worked with Willie Anne for years and wrote a beautiful essay in the catalog, as well as our curatorial assistant, Madeline Dugan, and our photo archivist, Kate Kaluzny. Together, we kind of combed through these archives, and the discoveries we made were amazing. But one of my favorite ones was just a clippings file, no name on it, but all the clippings were about women and changing gender roles. And some were serious articles on abortion or the pill or women in the workplace, but others were pieces on women getting tattoos, a grandmother who was voted homecoming queen, another grandmother who sailed across the Atlantic solo, and then a pair of broads who carjacked a taxi driver in a kind of Thelma Louise of the 1960s. And I think that it's this combination of sort of seriousness and lightheartedness and Willie Anne's fascination with the women that shaped her master's thesis, but also continued to shape her art. Now, I wanted to show you this picture. This is actually a iPhone picture of a photocopy of a photograph that still resides on Willie Anne's refrigerator. And it was made in Foley, Florida in 1954 when the young Willie Anne Wright was obviously the youngest child, was a new baby, and it was before I think she knew she would become a professional artist. But she titled this photograph Before the Revolution. And that sense that her life was about to change and that there was a kind of revolution both broadly within culture but within her own work, I think bears out over the next decade. And this I just thought was charming. It might be hard to read, but this is her artist information file that she submitted to the VMFA with one of the exhibitions. And she includes that she's married with 3 children, but also that the title of her thesis is, her thesis explores the image of contemporary women in art. Now, this is a painting she made in 1963, so she's still in the middle of grad school, sort of towards the tail end. And I think it really can kind of show you sort of where she's coming from and where she is going. It's called Nude and Three Graces, and it's actually a collage. So she's painted on canvas, but then both this piece and that piece are collaged onto the canvas. And there's clearly a lot of classical references here. The reclining nude might make you think of Titian or the 19th century painter Ingres, and of course the Three Graces is Botticelli or classicism. But the form itself is sort of simplified, maybe a little bit more like Matisse than Titian. And this shape here is suspiciously like a television set. And in fact, that is probably what it is. Starting around 1964, Willie Anne just completely embraced contemporary culture and changed the way she painted. I think it's very clear here, these bright, vibrant colors, these flat areas, sort of abstract silhouettes. This painting, which is entitled One Night at Jimmy's, we saw the Supremes on color television, was shown in an exhibition in 1967 at the VMFA, where it won the museum's sort of Distinguished Purchase Award, and it's the first work by Willie Anne that the museum acquired. And I think it really keys us into some of her enthusiasms at the time. She's a huge fan of the Supremes and Diana Ross, also Tina Turner, James Brown, pop music in general. But she's also picking up on new forms of media transmission, color television, and the kind of cultural transformations of seeing these amazing Black superstars coming in to the living rooms of sort of middle-class America, and all that change entailed. Now, she was not only painting television sets, she was also painting from television sets, and many of her early works were inspired by television or other forms of media. In fact, at the time, it was Jack, not Willie Anne, who was the family shutterbug, and he was the one always photographing the TV, and then she would take these pictures and kind of worked from them. Now, I just want to show you here, this is a photograph of her at the VMFA biennial, which is where we acquired this painting. And you can kind of get a sense of some of the work she's doing here. Also, note this painting here. This just popped up on Instagram, thank you, Madeline, over the summer. You can see here, this is the Pink Supremes. If anybody knows where this painting is, it's in a private collection, let us know. There's a couple mysteries that we're hoping to solve during the run of the show. But I think you can see here how much she loves the Supremes. But also what's so wonderful to me is just this sort of abstract floral thing kind of intruding on the canvas. And then the green Supremes. So I think you get the sense that she likes the Supremes. But what's also, I think, so interesting to me is, how the history of pop art has been written, has really been mostly through the lens of male artists. That's maybe starting to change. I'll get back to that. This is the painting I wanted to bring up. In fact, this is a work in VMFA's own collection by Rosalind Drexler. And there were, of course, women working in a pop idiom. But by and large, that story is still being told kind of through the lens of male artists. And Willie Anne has yet to be written into that history. So I'm hoping that this exhibition will do something to change that story. I also love this. I found this publicity still online late one night, and it was clear to me where the silver Julie Christie came from. Again, location unknowns. If you know, let us know. The family would like to track down some of these. But I also thought it was interesting that this particular movie, which was, I think, Julie Christie's breakout role, is also a movie about a kind of contemporary woman. She's a model in swinging London. She has all these love affairs, and then she has an abortion. And then, at the end, it's sort of unclear whether all of this freedom and change is something that is positive for her or not. And so this may look on the surface like it's just a kind of pop art painting taken from a publicity still or a television set, but really it's the movie, and I think the painting itself is kind of grappling with this question about gender and feminism and identity in the mid-'60s. And here I just wanted to show you several months after the acquisition of One Night in Jimmy's by VMFA, Willie Anne had a solo exhibition at Robinson House, just the little building across from the main entrance. It's had many different lives over the last century or so. But again, if anybody knows where Raquel Welch is, let us know. But I thought it was also kind of fun to see just, the kind of size and power of her paintings. And so by this point, she's only a few years out of grad school, and she is showing all over Virginia. And within several years in 1970, she's showing in a major show here, kind of a survey of American painting in 1970 that was organized by Peter Seltz, who was a famous contemporary art curator out of Berkeley. And so really, she's up there alongside of Cy Twombly and Mark Rothko and other major figures. Now, I've talked a little bit about Willie Anne's embrace of popular culture and contemporary culture and how seamlessly she fits into the kind of narrative around pop art. But what's also, for me, what was so wonderful and what kind of unlocked the key to the way that her paintings work with photography, and her photography will relate to paintings, we'll see that, is embedded in this work. And I'm going to talk you through it because it's a little complicated. This is called To O.G. Rylander and Diana Ross. And what you see here on the left is a nude, sort of the reclining nude figure, large size, and then a small reproduction, I would say a photograph of it up in the upper left corner. And then across the canvas, you see these kind of grids, these squared lines. And what I think it represents is a kind of traditional academic painting practice of painting from a photograph or a small sketch. You would square the image, and you would kind of translate the small squares into the large squares. So it's about painting from photography. And then you have on the right, this is a kind of stylized, abstracted representation of Diana Ross. And I see all of these horizontal graphite lines as being like a television set in the 60s, that kind of scrolling, this lines that sometimes happen. And then a wonderful sort of nod to Barnett Newman, perhaps, this little bright yellow zip down the corner. Now, the title clues us in to who this painting's about, obviously Diana Ross, but who is Rylander? Well, Rylander was a 19th century photographer who worked in Britain, and he actually worked primarily producing very theatrical compositions and a lot of studies for painters. The fact that Willie Anne knew who Rylander was in the late 60s is quite interesting, although it shouldn't come as a total surprise. This was a moment of kind of the discovery or rediscovery of 19th century photography, and particularly British photography. A number of exhibitions were starting to be produced. It was the first time auction houses were selling photography, and they usually started with 19th century British photography. At the same time, there were a number of new art history books coming out looking at the relationship between painting and photography. And Willie Anne, in her archives, kind of wrote an essay later on talking about the impact of these texts. So she's clearly thinking about the relationship between painting and photography, but also between 19th century and contemporary and different kind of models of female beauty and identity. And she will continue to explore the history of art in very contemporary-looking canvases like this one. This one is Venus in Morning Glories, and it was only thanks to an interview in an article from the 70s about this painting that I discovered that her interest in morning glories is not just because they're pretty flowers, but they're also hallucinogenic plants. And she loved that fact that they were both beautiful, but also had kind of a relationship to the 1970s, culture of drugs. And then when she was asked about whether she had taken drugs in the article, she said, "Oh my goodness, no," because she's a nice Southern lady and she would never do anything like that. But she did like them. And then you can see here, though, that her reference is the Venus de Medici. She's got the Venus twinned. Twins and doubles will reappear a lot in Willie Anne's work. She says it's because she's a Gemini, and that's her zodiac sign. But I think doubling and twinning is also kind of something that's inherent to photography and maybe representation more generally, and so she really loves to play with it. So you'll see that come up a bit. And then this is a painting that hangs in her house, and you can see once again the way that she's using classical figures in a very kind of contemporary pop way. Now, her paintings in the 1960s look a lot like silk screens, these sort of flat areas of color. Some of them look like they've been squeegeed on, but she painted them. So many people mistook them for silk screens that she decided that she would start to make silk screens. And so she started experimenting with printmaking, and this is one of my favorite prints. To make these, she started with actually photographs of clouds or waves. She did a whole series like this, which she then kind of serialized and turned into prints. And the title of this one, for Heraclitus, is a reference to the Greek philosopher whose philosophy, to put it in a very, very dumbed-down nutshell, is like, everything's in flux, everything's changing. But that was a concept that really kind of suited Willie Anne, who herself embraced change. The biggest change, though, that would happen would be in 1972, when her husband gave her a 35mm camera so that she could start to document her paintings more professionally, to send them out, to exhibitions and competitions. So she decided to sign up for a photography class at VCU, I think, and she thought she would be learning how to make photographs with her new camera, and instead, the instructor, George Nan, whose work is here, and also a beloved figure in the Richmond photography community, instructed the students on day one that they were going to have to make a pinhole camera, and nobody was very excited about that. They all wanted to use the shiny new technology. So what's a pinhole camera? I just took this off the internet. It's not perfect, but essentially it's a box. It could be an oatmeal container. I saw one recently that was a dog food container, one of those metal bins. Any kind of light, tight container. All you really need is a hole. There's no lens. That's the whole point. It's lensless. And at the back, it says screen here, but really you put in sensitized photo paper, film, anything that will receive light and react to it. And that's it. So it's really an incredibly rudimentary form of photography. And it was for Willie Anne a revelation. She loved the ways in which pinhole photography kind of transformed the scene in front of her. Now, I always knew that she had taken this photography class and that she loved, what happened. I'll say that the first picture that she produced was this one. It was a classmate. But she very quickly began to think about sort of the pinhole as a conduit to the past, to the 19th century. And in fact, for several, maybe a year or two before she took this pinhole class, she had been working on a series of paintings that were based on some late 19th century photographs that her father had given her of people at a picnic. And she was not happy with the painting. She couldn't quite get what she wanted. So when she made the photographs, she realized that that was the connection to the past that she desired. And this really started a new way of working for her. One, first of all, outdoors with other people, with live models, not in the studio. And also, different scale and different size. Now, her interest in the 19th century, especially 19th century Britain, that she'd already demonstrated in that picture that I showed you, I think deepened at this moment. And she began to sort of look at making pictures that reflected this longer history. She toned them with sepia. This is why these look sort of brown. They are gelatin silver prints, which is what we call black and white photography. But she toned them so that they would look like 19th century photographs. But she was also, I think, keenly aware of the example of many 19th century photographers, and especially women photographers. On the right is a work by Lady Clementina Howardin, who's a Viscountess Howardin, as a mother of 10 children, not all of whom survived past birth, but still, and an incredibly accomplished amateur photographer, because I don't think she needed the money, but she would create these beautiful tableaux vivants and portrait studies with her daughters and circles of her family and friends, often using mirrors and windows to create these very beautiful effects. So I think you can see the relationship here. Now, Willie Anne was not just sort of channeling the 19th century. She was actually photographing in Maymont at this time, which, of course, is the sort of beautiful Belle Epoque mansion in Richmond. And at the time, she managed to sort of do a photo shoot there. I think, let's see, her models may or may not have borrowed some clothes from Mrs. Julie's closet. This was sort of perhaps a day when the caretaker was not on the premises. I won't go too much into this, but I've heard many stories from Willie Anne and her colleagues, which could just go under the title of Rules We Broke to Get Pictures. Anyway, to get back to it, here I wanted to show you Willie Anne with one of her cameras, the beloved Morris camera, both so you can kind of see what it looks like. They come in different sizes, and we have different size cameras in our archives now, but also that she has wrapped this camera in William Morris newspaper. He is the late 19th century, designer and theorist. So she absolutely loves the material culture of the 19th century. She also painted this little leaf on there. This one's in the exhibition, so it's one of our favorites. And then she began to use it in different ways, including sort of as a mount for some of her photographs here. And you can see how here she's actually layered multiple things. She's got the Amelia Morris wallpaper, and then this is a photograph she made, and then another photograph on top of it. So we're really getting into a kind of deeply, there she is with some friends, deeply 19th century moment. But this is typical of Willie Anne. There's one side of her that is immersed in the past, and another that is very present and very contemporary. And this really shows itself, I think, in particular in the color work. Starting at about 1976, she began to experiment with color photography. But she did something that nobody, as far as I know, had done at that point. She took a relatively new material. The trade name is Cibachrome. We call it silver dye bleach print. And this was had been introduced in the 60s. And this is a material that normally was used if you wanted to print your slides, which, as you know, are not negatives, color slides, onto these beautiful prints. That's what you would do, and you do it in a dark room, or more likely a lab would do it for you. So it's what we call a positive-to-positive process. There's no negative involved. So Willie Anne decided just to put the paper in her camera and see what would happen. Now, the initial experiments didn't work out too well because the paper is sensitized for tungsten light, in other words, for being exposed to light in a dark room and not out in sun. But that didn't stop Willie Anne. She wrote to numerous scientists and manufacturers and learned to kind of correct for these problems by using a variety of filters so that the sort of dark and blue cast that tended to appear would disappear. And she began to make color photographs. And this is really also a moment in photography more broadly when photographers started embracing, artistic photographers started embracing color. Color had long been used in commercial processes and magazine advertisements, but it kind of had that taint of commercialness. And, you know, serious art photographers only worked in black and white. And so this started to change in the 1970s, and Willie Anne's embrace of color, I think, is very much of the moment. And she also worked, you know, close at home. Now, there were a lot of issues around working with this material outside. The exposures were long and slow, and so she often focused on still life. And this is not an action shot kind of film. But she also did wonderful series, like this one is 3 of 10, showing the kind of life and death of a pile of gourds in her backyard. So under a pile of snow in the middle, towards the end, this kind of the husk of the gourd remains. And as she began to develop her confidence working with Cibachrome material, she also built a larger camera, one that would take 16 by 20 inch paper. And to do a 16 by 20 inch direct positive, that is making the print right inside the camera with no negative, took a lot of skill and a lot of confidence. And the exposure times for these were quite long. Now this picture, I want to clue you in a little bit. It's called Fruits and Flowers, Homage to Roger Fenton. Roger Fenton is another 19th century British photographer. And what Willie Anne has done is created her own photographic homage to this pioneering photographer. She's also right there tucked Fenton's print into it. Now when Roger Fenton made this, there was no color photography. Well, it kind of was, but we won't get into the technical details. But he probably could not have ever imagined doing something so vibrant. And so Willie Anne is really both kind of incorporating this history, inserting herself into it, but also, of course, adding on to it in this wonderful way. And I just wanted to note that she started to show this work in various places, and there was a journalist who ran across it at the Whitkin Gallery in New York in the early 80s and described her pictures thus. They had the chiaroscuro of the 16th century, the weird perspective of El Greco, and the pearly tones of 20th century dye in plastic. And I kind of love that because that sense of different temporalities and art histories converging is, I think, what is so unique and wonderful about a lot of these pictures. Willie Anne, of course, loved Roger Fenton. She made photographic homages to a number of 19th century photographers. But the one she admired most was Julia Margaret Cameron, that pioneering British photographer who is considered the sort of leading female photographer of the 19th century. And she even photographed herself here holding a portrait of Cameron. This is not a self-portrait. It was actually made by her son. And then we don't actually even know how this was made. This was collaged onto this photograph, which was probably made using a series of mirrors. I asked Willie Anne. She didn't actually remember how she made it, so we've decided that it was just magic. And I'm going to leave it at that. But I think that identification with Julia Margaret Cameron also should clue us into something else that was really important to her in the 1970s. And that is that even as she was building her reputation as a photographer and showing and selling work, she also started lecturing across Virginia on women artists and the history of women artists. And this is actually a little brochure she made up where she has her slide lecture, and she would give it at different museums and community organizations and women's centers. And I think it's really critical to acknowledge that this was just the moment of sort of the writing of women into art history. It's an ongoing process, and Willie Anne was at the forefront of it, and I think deserves to be recognized kind of for her role in pushing forward the history of women. She did a general lecture on kind of the history of women artists, the sort of Jansen-et, but also on the history of women artists in Virginia. And this was something that she was keenly aware of because she had studied at VCU, well, RPI then, with Teresa Pollock, the woman who essentially founded the art department at VCU, but also noted that Teresa Pollock had herself learned from two women, Adele Clark and Nora Houston, in the early 20th century, and they themselves, at least Adele Clark, had learned from a 19th century woman, Lily Logan. So Willie Anne called this the apostolic succession of women artists in Virginia, and she clearly saw herself as sort of part of this, but also championing it for others. And I can't tell you how many other women have come up to me who have worked with Willie Anne. She has been a mentor and a friend, so I really want to acknowledge that. And then the other thing to talk about is her sense of humor, which I think comes out in a lot of work. She began making still lives, these beautiful, luscious, 19th century, abundant piles of fruit and flowers, but also these funny constructions that she saw as sort of like almost dreams, using terms like fantasy and the unconscious, and bringing these incongruous objects together. And the peculiar aspects of Pinhole, the way that space is kind of converges in the center and seems stretched out at the end, and there's not really a depth of field, really also responds or enhances the dreamlike kind of qualities of these images. And this in particular with these gloves, I think of somebody like Kurator, sort of animating, that spirit animating these pictures. But this back and forth for her between the past and the present, between the humorous and the serious, this is all very sort of typical of Willie Anne. I just want to keep my eye on the time. Okay. And I think even though she was so deeply immersed in the past, she was also very aware of wanting to do contemporary work. And one of the subjects she found to express the contemporary moment was sort of swimming pools. And she began photographing women, friends around town who had swimming pools. And I think what she really loved was the ways in which the effects of Pinhole, which already kind of distorted space, were exaggerated with the geometries of these pools, the way that the waters would sort of reflect, or the sides of the pools. And here you might notice the twins again. And also these sort of contemporary images of suburban leisure. and was fascinated with what happened over these exposures that were, of course, several minutes long. So here, the pool hose that's kind of drifting slowly in the water kind of takes on this sea monster-like aspect. And I should note that while she's primarily focusing on her photography and her professional career, she never stopped painting, but the relationship was sort of reversed, where she had once snapped or used photographs as the basis for her paintings. Now, very often, it was her photographs that would, sometimes come after a painting, or it would inspire a painting, but the act of the photograph was no longer preliminary. It was very often the sort of the primary objective. And she made a series of photographs at the beaches. Now, why? In part, people stay still there. They don't move a lot. There's beautiful golden light. But also, she could find this wonderful configurations of bodies in space. And here, I'd like you to note these three kind of almost like sentinels disappearing. And that's what happens when you have an extended exposure. But it infuses these pictures with a sense of mystery, and at the same time, the wonderful sense of humor, where you have the figure on the Matisse towel mirrored by the bathing suit-clad woman. And she didn't just go to the beach when there were lots of people there. She did a series of photographs at boardwalks and beaches and pools when they were essentially abandoned, temporarily abandoned during the fall and winter. And here she really took advantage of the beautiful light and the kind of quality of loneliness that these pictures induce. And I love this one, too, because it reminds us that this was made directly in the camera. And because of that, with no negative, that everything is laterally reversed. And then you see here, too, the incredible way that this golden light kind of fills the work. And there's a quality to sebachrome that really can't be replicated in any other color medium. So I encourage you, when you go to the exhibition, to get up close as the guards will let you, and you'll be able to see a little bit of a metallic quality to the prints. And this is in part why these pictures have such an inner glow to them. In 1987, she kind of happened upon two new subjects that would occupy her for more than a decade. And the first was like a cold call. Somebody called her and wanted her to do like a pregnancy shoot. She's not normally that kind of person, but she took on the challenge and produced this work entitled Before Luca. And it's just an absolutely beautiful, luscious work, and the kind of elongation of the legs, and the way of the body sort of immersed in nature is incredibly alluring. And that got her interested in photographing pregnant women. And now, there's a lot of pictures of mothers in the history of art. That seems to be fair game for both men and women. A lot of pictures of children, not too many pictures of pregnant women. There are a few examples, of course, that contradict that, including this beautiful piece by Emmett Gowan of his wife, Edith, which is now in our collection. And here, clearly the artist is celebrating and enamored of this, his wife's beauty and fecundity and the child to come. But Willie Anne started making photographs of pregnant women, and they really focus on the woman herself as in this liminal state. And that's emphasized by the titles, which are always before and then the name of the child, before Leah and Audrey. And to me, these are really not so much pictures of pregnancy as they are pictures of psychology. And I'd just like you to think about that Emmett Gowan picture of his wife and this one. I think we get a very different sense of what pregnancy and childhood and motherhood might mean. She seems trapped in a camping tent. Or here, the kind of ways in which relationships shift and change inevitably, the rupture and remaking of identity that building a family can incur. And I think these pictures are powerful in part because they are really built out of, Willie Anne's many years of thinking about women, not her being a mother, but thinking about women and their experiences. The other series that she started in 1987, also kind of by accident, is one of her best known, Civil War Redux. And she had stepped out for a walk one Saturday morning with her husband and happened upon a Civil War reconstruction in downtown Richmond. This was in 1987, so it was part of the 125th anniversary of the Civil War celebrations. And she had never been particularly interested in Southern history or Civil War history, despite, perhaps because of growing up in Richmond. But what she loved about these reconstructions, what drew her in, was the convergence of presence of the past and the present. And I think, this picture here with the swaggering General Custer and the Dodge truck that says Army, U.S. Army on it, it kind of all comes together. And she began to photograph reconstructions, and over the next, I don't know how many years, 12 years, she photographed 44 different reconstructions in Virginia and other southern states, not all southern states, actually. And she photographed both Confederates and Union soldiers. Here, she's also photographing the photographer. There were many Reconstructionists who took on the role of people like Matthew Brady. And, one of the interesting things is that Willie Anne's pinhole camera was in many ways less sophisticated than the cameras of the 19th century photographers who photographed the Civil War. And I won't go too far into this, but the Civil War was probably, it was sort of ushered, it was the first majorly photographed war and sort of brought the war to a kind of new sense of importance and immediacy for the American public. Now, there were no action shots at that time. Photographers were still using glass plates that they had to prepare on site. So they too were posing their subjects, but their exposures were probably faster than Willie Anne's. But she loved the ways in which her camera kind of connected her to the past. And a sort of cute anecdote is at one point she writes to a photographic historian because she had discovered the name of a Civil War photographer named Alma Pelot. And she writes to find out disappointed to find out that Alma is actually a man. And she says, I wish I could find a female Civil War photographer to identify with. So you can see where she's really sort of looking into that. But she's photographing these people in their reconstructions, and on the right, that's just a 19th century photograph that I meant to replace, so we'll just pass it. But she also was photographing, she's particularly interested in two groups of reenactors who she photographed frequently, and these include Black Civil War soldiers or people playing, especially members of the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, and maintained a correspondence with many of them. And many of these soldiers actually really kind of were professional reenactors, and many of them, this Massachusetts 54th Reenactment Company also starred in the film Glory. And then she was fascinated with women and the role of women as mourners, usually in the Civil War or in these Civil War reenactments. And once again, here, her fascination with women and their dual roles comes to the fore. Now, the act of photographing the Civil War reconstructions brought her all around the Southern landscape. And she had not really focused on landscape per se, either in her painting or her photography until this time. But she began photographing battlefields, graveyards, really these sites of kind of memory and loss. And it's around this time that she's also thinking about how photography captures the past. She cites the famous William Faulkner quote, "The past is never dead, it's not even past," multiple times in her archives and her writing. And she begins to make these very elegiac photographs that are, devoid of people and seem like time has stood still. This is a cabin for enslaved people, but also photographing well-known sites like the ruins of Windsor, the ruins of a plantation that burned down in 1890. Now, this is a moment, too, in which Willie Anne's work really touches on a longer history of Southern photography, and kind of she puts herself within this. And I'm just showing you Windsor, like everybody's photographed Windsor. So I just picked two at random, Eudora Welty, the photographer as well as writer, on the left, or Clarence John Laughlin on the right. But Willie Anne herself is kind of a part of this lineage of photographers who are looking at the Southern landscape as a landscape of loss, as a landscape of conflict. But her sense of humor remains. She was delighted to find this grave marker for the arm of Stonewall Jackson, which was buried about 100 miles from the rest of Stonewall Jackson's body. And, that to me is the sort of Willie Anne twist and that little bit of humor that balances the pathos of much of what she's doing. And then, she embraces this aesthetic of the Southern Gothic as well with a series she calls The Woman in White. And here she's kind of really ginning up the Southern Gothic with placing her against this abandoned house. These pictures are really beautiful and moving. They are sort of theatrical constructions that also, they look back to a history of kind of theatrical Southern photography, like Clarence John Laughlin, you can see here, the shadows, but also relate to her the contemporary work of Sally Mann, an artist that she knew, of course. And they had shown together at a number of exhibitions in Virginia. Sally Mann also conjuring the fraught Southern landscape through process, through kind of using a 19th century process. But I would say, too, artists like Deborah Tuberville and Francesca Woodman, and what these women have in common is sort of using photography to try to capture something beyond the crisp edges of reality, a kind of invisible spiritualism. And that really leads us to the last part of my talk, I promise, and the last section of the exhibition. And this is really Willie Anne embracing photography as a conduit to the past. And she does so in a couple of ways, and one is through clothing. She collected and was given a lot of beautiful antique clothing, which she, in this series, sets up in these humorous tableaus so that these kind of disembodied but animated clothes are playing cards or seeming to dance. But she also begins to make photograms with them. And here she has moved from lensless photography to cameraless photography. The photogram, for those of you who don't know, is essentially taking a sheet of photographic paper, sensitized paper, placing an object onto it and exposing it to light. So really where the light hits the paper the most, the paper darkens the most. It darkens in proportion to the amount of light it receives. So translucent objects kind of create, beautiful effects in photograms. And she is creating photograms really of antique clothing. And she's not the only artist to do so at this time. There are other artists who are thinking about the relationship between photography as a trace and clothing as a trace, and all of these being the art of memory. On the left is a beautiful work by Adam Foose, also as this part of a series called My Ghost, in which really came out of sort of his contemplation of loss. And on the right is Shiushi Miyako, a photographer who after her mother died, photographed her mother's clothing and objects and lipstick and felt that what was left of her mother was embedded in these objects, and that the photograph, in a way, was a way of preserving these aspects of her mother. And so Willie Anne is doing this as well, thinking about photography as a trace, but she's also thinking about photography as a historical practice. And she begins to do photograms with lots of flowers, and this does date back, to the 19th century, and also to one of the first women photographers, Anna Atkins, who would make these photograms of plant specimens, really as part of a kind of study of botany. Willie Anne is doing that there on the right. And then she's thinking about Victorian practices as well, using flowers and using photography together. This is an album page. In the Victorian period, women often created these beautiful photo albums in which they decorated with paintings, watercolors, flowers. And Willie Anne actually kept photocopies of some of these albums as inspiration, like her Pinterest board in a way. And I think you can see that here in this work, where she has taken 19th century photographs and she has kind of scanned them and made like a second transparency, and she's kind of made it both negative and positive so that it looks like we're seeing these women and their ghosts kind of accompanying them, surrounded by flowers. And she is interested in the idea of the photograph as kind of conjuring a ghost. This is not actually the only time she'll do that in her photograph. On the left, this kind of sort of ethereal evocation of a man, floating, and the title is Not Forgotten. Or on the right, Wilson's Cult. We can imagine Wilson perhaps went off to the war and never came back. But these are sort of pieces that look back to Victorian memory practices of not only making photographs, but also including things like flowers or bits of hair, but using photography as a memorializing practice. And Willie Anne had a lot of fun with this, not only putting together lace and 19th century photographs that she collected, but also, once again, her fascination with twins and doubling. She took one photograph, she flipped it. The title on the top said, "Twins we were, twins we are." Sorry, I don't have my glasses, something like that. Am I you, are you me? And then she took this composition on the left, and then, of course, she just made there's a positive version and a negative version. So, again, twinning is inherent to her practice, but it's also inherent, really, to photography. And then, again, photography as an art of memory. Here she is taking a beautiful photogram of an antique dress that she's layered on top of another photograph she's made of a child, little Gracie Watson, who's memorialized at Bonaventure Cemetery. And she sort of placed them all together in a kind of photographic homage. And I mentioned her interest in photography and kind of as an art of memory, but she also was fascinated with the Victorian genre of spirit photography. And these were photographs that were purported to capture spirits. And there's a number of these that continue throughout the early 20th century. Some of you may have heard of William Mumler, but things like double exposure or flares, sometimes these were accidental, very often they were on purpose, but they were thought to capture the spirits and the ghosts of the departed. And Willie Anne herself actually became really interested in spirit photography after she made this photograph. And it's at the grave of La Tannée, who was the, I think, only soldier killed at J.B. Stuart's route. But it was this kind of strange cloud, miasma that appeared that she decided was the ghost of La Tannée who had appeared. And so she began kind of looking into spirit photography at that time. Of course, there she was at the grave itself. And this idea of channeling the past culminates in her final series that she made really around 2015 and 16. In 2006, she was given a plant, a Brugmansia plant, also called Angel's Trumpet by a friend, and she named it Bobo. And she loved Bobo, and she particularly loved Bobo's flowers, and she started making photograms with the petals, with the blossoms, with the stems. And these photograms she didn't expose in the dark room. Some of those very dark black and white ones she did. These ones were what she calls lumen prints, where she put them outside, so they printed out in the sun. She would lay the plants down and then leave them out in the sun, sometimes for an hour, 2 hours, or more. And the unpredictable chemistry of these create these incredibly beautiful range of tones of purple and violet and blue, and they're really extraordinary. And I just put that up because on the back of her prints, she often notes that how long it took. This is an hour and a half. Sometimes also the time, not just the time of day, but the weather conditions. All of this is kind of wonderful fodder for curators. And then she began using these plants in various compositions, kind of combining her interest in 19th century, Victorian culture with the Brugmansia plant. And I just want to go through this little comparison because it kind of gives us an insight into Willie Anne's way of working. This is a cabinet card that was made in Richmond in the 1880s. All we know is that it was on the back, it says the Smoots. So we assume that perhaps there were 5 Smoot daughters, but one is not like the others. Willie Anne homed in on this figure here who probably said, "No way am I wearing that stupid thing in my hair." And I do not want my picture taken. In fact, I'm kind of annoyed by this whole thing. So she singled out this figure and actually incorporated her into a number of photographs. And this one is called A Season of Vexation. And I think we really see that Willie Anne has managed to look at this cabinet card that most of us would just pass by and identify the pissed-off Victorian woman who would rather be in a T-shirt and jeans. But it is a kind of wonderful sense into the way that for her, history is not the past. It is a kind of a rich body of experiences that kind of flows into the present, and that is fodder for art. And that same thing happened for her when she discovered the work of Pamela Colman Smith. I won't go into too much detail because I'm basically at the very tail end of my hour. But Pamela Colman Smith was an incredible, poly-talented figure who was born in London. I think I have the date here somewhere. 1878, but I think her mother was Jamaican, her father was British. She was a writer and editor. She wrote a couple of the first books on folklore of Jamaica. She was an illustrator. She was an occultist. We'll get into that more later. She studied art with Arthur Wesley Dow. She acted in theatrical troupes with Ellen Terry. She launched a literary magazine in New York in 1907. She was the first painter to have paintings shown at galleries run by Alfred Stieglitz in New York. And she collaborated with the mystic Arthur Edward Waite on illustrations for the tarot. She did that in the 1920s, and this tarot deck was reissued in 1970 and is now the most popular one in the world. So Willie Anne really created this last series an homage to Colman Smith. It was clear that she, once again, found a strong female figure with whom she could identify. And she was, she'd known the tarot. In fact, tarot cards appear in a few of her earlier works. But all of a sudden, she starts to actually think about what the tarot cards look like. And she noticed that one of Colman Smith's illustrations for the card of judgment shows an angel blowing a trumpet, and that to her connected to the Brugmansia plant, also known as the angel's trumpet plant. So she started making essentially a series of cards, combining elements of Colman Smith's art with her own. And I just want to end here. This last card is the Hanged Man, and I think you can see here, in the center, she's drawn pretty tightly from Colman Smith, the Hanged Man, but she's chosen these dried up Brugmansia blossoms. Usually they're fulsome, and these ones are thin and dried. And I should mention that Brugmansia plants are very beautiful. They're bright yellow, but they also have a kind of a hallucinogenic and sometimes toxic side to them. They are used in certain cultures and kind of shamanistic ceremonies, and they can be deadly when ingested too much. And this, of course, delighted Willie Anne, and it made it perfect for something like the tarot. But I wanted to end on this one, too, because the Hanged Man seems like it's about death and the end. But in fact, for Arthur Edward Waite, who wrote about this card, he described it as a conduit between the universe and the divine. And I think this is also kind of how Willie Anne sees photography and sees art more generally, kind of a channel between past and present, and between the material world and the world of spirit or imagination. And I think her gift as an artist has also been to be a conduit. I mean, she's been the glue of the Richmond art community, and she's brought together so many people, including all of you here tonight. So thank you.